Welcome to Discovery Day at Chandler-Gilbert Community College. I'm Dr. Kimberly Patterson of the Biological Sciences Division, and today we'll be speaking with Nick Baker, a bee enthusiast and local apiarist. We're going to talk about honeybees, their colony formations, the difference between queens, drones, and worker bees. We'll talk about what kind of work bees do for our society. And lastly, we'll talk about where they do that work and what Africanized bees mean for our honeybee populations here. So if you're ready, let's talk bees. So can you give us a quick background on honeybees?
Yeah, absolutely. So here I have some nice little pictures so we can see these beautiful little girls right here. And right down here, these are the brood boxes or the bee boxes that we use for commercial beekeeping or even at the hobby level. But we should probably learn a little bit about bees themselves to kind of understand why they're so important to agriculture and to everyday life. So when we talk about honeybees, they have a caste system that we can use to exploit essentially for our own production of foods and, of course, their delicious honey. But when we get into a beehive, it's broken down into three major players. You're going to have your queen, who you can see. I have a little scale size so we can kind of see the scale of each one of these little organisms here. But we have the queen bee here, and her main job is to just lay eggs. That's all she's going to do her entire life. We also have drone bees here. So drones are the male bees. They do no work for the hive itself. The only thing they do is feed on the food and pass their genetics on. And they die as soon as they mate. And then we have the most important ones outside of the queen, which would be the workers here. So the workers are all females, and they do all of the work, hence the name worker, for the beehive itself. So from the time they emerge, they begin doing nursing tasks like taking care of the young larvae, cleaning the house, cleaning the queen, etc. And then, matter of fact, down here, I have a nice little picture of a comb that I took that has all three of these different castes represented here. Maybe if you just take 1 second, you can take a close look and see if you can identify all three of these in this picture. I'll just give you a quick second here. So the first one, this here, I can tell that this would be the queen bee. By the length of the abdomen here happens to be about the same size as the worker bee itself. And the way that gives our drones here, the male bees, away are these big, gigantic eyeballs. Notice their head is about twice the size as a worker bee. And rather than having a very thin abdomen, they have a very wide, thick abdomen. Oops. And so then the rest of these little ones here would all be the worker bees. So what is the queen here? This very important one. It's got a little paint mark on it. This is what us beekeepers like to use to identify a queen bee very quickly in the colony. It's important because we only have one queen per colony. So if anything happens to this little lady right here, the whole colony could be affected. So if we can put a little paint mark, sometimes we can find her that much easier inside a colony that's just filled with all these insects that look pretty much the same. So as I mentioned, one queen per hive. She can live up to 2 years. On average is about 18 months. And she'll lay around 2,000 eggs per day. So in her lifetime, she'll lay over roughly 2 million eggs in her lifetime. After she does her mating flight, so the only time a queen will leave the colony is after she emerges. She'll go out to orientate, so fly around the hive to get an idea where her beehive is at. And then once she goes back inside, figures that out, another week or so will pass, and then she'll go out for a mating flight, and she'll mate with about anywhere between 25 and 35 drones. All right, this is to ensure that she gets a nice mixture of genetics. And then she will come back and she will never leave the hive again after her mating flight. The worker bees, as I mentioned before, they're all female, and they only live about 6 weeks. So you have a queen who can live up to 2 years, whereas the average worker lifespan is about 6 weeks. They spend their time from first emergence as cleaning the house and feeding the kids. So this is what we call nursing tasks, and this would be considered a nurse bee. And after about 2 weeks of doing nothing but staying inside the hive and doing nursing tasks, they'll leave. They'll do an orientation flight. So they'll fly around the hive once again to get an idea of where their beehive is. And from that point on, they will begin to collect food such as nectar and pollen. And you will have some bees that their life is dedicated to collecting water only. And they will continue this foraging activity up until the point when they die. And they'll either die in the field, or maybe they come back and they die at the entrance of the hive. But we have specialized bees, specialized bees that act as grave robbers or grave diggers, and they take those dead bees and they throw them out of the colony because they want the colony to stay very hygienic. And then we have also a very small set of bees that end up as guard bees, and they sit at the front of the entrance and they watch who is coming in and who is going. And then we have the drone bees. These are our male drones. You can see quite the size difference, especially in that head. Those big eyeballs really give them away. They live about 4 weeks from the time they emerge. As I mentioned before, they do zero work in the colony. Their only job is to gorge on honey until they're strong enough and old enough to go on a mating flight. And then once they leave and go on their mating flight, they die as soon as they mate with the queen. Very interestingly enough, drone bees also are haploid, meaning they only have one set of chromosomes versus the workers, which are diploid. And so when a queen is laying an egg, this is probably one of the coolest things that when I think about queens, one of the coolest things is that she can fertilize an egg if she wants to. So if she's laying eggs, she'll introduce one sperm at a time to each egg, and then lay it in the cell, and then it can develop into a worker bee. Or she can take her spermatheca and turn it off and not introduce a sperm to an egg, and then just lay an unfertilized egg, and that one will turn into a drone. So life cycles. Each one of the life cycles is a little different for both the queen, the worker, and the drone. So from the time a queen lays a worker egg, it takes about 21 days for that worker bee to finally emerge and start actually doing work. Now, versus the queen bee, which is about 16 days from the time the egg is laid until the queen actually emerges, and 24 days for drones from the time that the queen lays the egg for that drone bee to actually emerge from the cell itself. So they even have quite different times for when the time they actually emerge from the cells.
So, Nick, does the queen bee choose the next queen?
Very interesting. So it's all based on diet, and it's actually not the queen who chooses who will be the next queen, but it's actually the workers. And the workers feed the queen bees a special diet called royal jelly, and that will transform a regular everyday worker bee, larvae, I should say, into a queen bee. So it will grow differently than the rest of them. And it's purely based on the diet that larvae is fed. As far as which bee chooses which larvae gets to become the queen, as far as I know, that's still random, and we don't have quite a full answer on if bees specifically seek out a certain egg or not. I hope that helped.
Yes, thank you.
Here's a short little, quick little video I believe I took of a comb here. You can see, before I even hit play, I want to point a couple things out. So it's a little hazy here, but you can see these white glistening things, I hope. These are the actual larvae, so they have not been sealed over. What we see in these brown spots here are larvae that have been sealed over, and right now they are growing from a larvae into a bee, and at the point when they reach that 21 days, they will chew their way out of the cell and they will begin working at that point. The rest of these have not been sealed over just yet. All right, so here we can see the larvae, and then you can see where they've been sealed over, and they will stay in those combs until they emerge and start taking care of the rest of the bees. And this over here would be capped honey, and so they'll use that as food. I don't see the queen on here, but we'll keep looking and we'll come back. So you could hear the bees in the background flying around. What I'd like to say about this is actually a comb from an Africanized honeybee hive. So I'm going to talk about that a little bit later here, but the bees are a little bit more aggressive when they're in these, when they're Africanized versus a nice, gentle European colony. So all bees here in the state of Arizona, just as a preface, they're all, if it's a feral colony, they are considered to be Africanized. We no longer have any pure European honeybees that are feral here within the state. And I'll talk more about how that can impact your honeybee colony if you have one in your yard. So here's just real quickly some equipment we use. These are suits. Here I am at my friend's farm down in Casa Grande working my beehives. Each one of these colonies, each one of these stacks of boxes you see here is a bee colony. So I have 4 colonies on a pallet. We use forklifts to pick up the pallets and then put them on trucks and then drive them to their next location. We do that in the evening when it's dark out because bees do not fly at night. And before the sun goes down, the majority of them will make it back from the field back to their house. So that way we can be happy knowing that all the bees have made it home before we actually move them to their new spot. Down here, we can see the smoker and a hive tool. So we use smoke to help calm the bees down. This actually gets them to start engorging on food within the combs. And that kind of brings them back in the colony and just keeps them calm a little bit. And then here you can see, this is me in a half suit here with gloves on. These are bees flying all around. Again, this was an area that had quite a few Africanized colonies in it before I was able to requeen them. And here you can see how good beekeeping is when your bees are nice and gentle and they're not Africanized. I would not have to wear a suit or anything else to work these bees because they're very gentle and nice. I even had some that were so nice I didn't even have to use smoke on them. I do recommend always wearing a veil. Excuse me, I couldn't think of that. I do recommend always wearing a veil just because even when you pop a lid open, bees tend to just kind of fly up naturally and they may accidentally bump you in the head and sting you. And so typically I wear a veil just to keep that, accidents from happening. So what do we do all day as a beekeeper? Well, one thing, you can see these queen cells down here. So if you'll notice, these queen cells grow quite differently than a regular larvae cell. They grow much larger because, again, the queen is much bigger. So, and if you look very closely, you can see eggs that have been laid in each one of these open combs here that look like little pieces of rice. And then here we can actually see older larvae. These are probably about a week old at this point, just looking at the size. And then we have the capped over brood, and there's a drone bee right there, and then a bunch of workers. There's another drone right there. And so it's really easy to spot queen cells, again, because they are very large. We don't want new queens here, at least here in Arizona, emerging and going out and mating and then coming back and starting to lay eggs, because at some point that hive will become very aggressive. So here in Arizona, we like to look for queen cells to keep our nice commercial colonies gentle. We check for diseases. This is a living, breathing organism. And like everywhere, like us, they also get sick. And here, this is what we call a chalk brood. So this is actually caused by a by fungus spore. And then what we see over here, and in some of these here, this was a very diseased colony. You can see these black, scabby looking things in the back. Well, there's still a little larvae there. And what ends up happening, this is American foul brood. American foul brood is very detrimental to beekeepers, especially on the East Coast or places where it's very humid. It's a bacterial disease, and once the bees get infected, they can spread the disease to nearby colonies. Bees tend to drift from one colony to the next, and so if there's a bacterial or a disease, they can drift to a neighbor's house and then spread it there. So what ends up happening, a test you can use to check and see if this is foul brood, is by this ropey texture here. When you take a stick or a matchstick and push and rub around on that dead larvae and you pull it out, it becomes very ropey. At this point, you would burn the colony, kill all the bees, and not use that equipment again. You could burn the inside of the equipment, but for me, I've only seen this disease twice in the 15 years I've done this, and both times I isolated this bee colony, and unfortunately I had to eradicate it by burning all the frames, the bees themselves, and everything. This just can be a very bad disease for a yard.
Wow.
And then another one here, this is the big one. This is the varroa mite destructor. What ends up happening is bees, as the egg is being laid, these mites will crawl in there almost like a tick, and then it gets sealed over. And if a female and a male get in here, or a pregnant female, she will lay her eggs. They will emerge and they will begin to drink the blood of the larvae. And as they're drinking the blood of the larvae, they're doing things like spraying disease, as you know, ticks can do that kind of thing. And we end up getting through those diseases things like deformed wing virus, where you can see the wings are completely deformed and useless. So this honeybee is never going to forage. It's never going to be able to get food. And this is probably the biggest problem that beekeepers have, is the varroa mite. And so we're always trying to find new ways of either eradicating it or keeping the levels low enough that it doesn't affect your colony as a whole.
Is the varroa mite common in Arizona, across the country, all of the above?
It's common all over the world. Unfortunately, you will find varroa mites pretty much anywhere you find honeybees. We've had quite a few inventions over the years to try and get rid of them, and other things like, I guess it would be a pesticide that's used that affects specifically mites. But unfortunately, yeah, this is a disease that never goes away, and a good beekeeper is going to treat their colonies at least a minimum of 3 times a year. I would say even 4 or 5 times a year to be safe. Yes, and the coolest thing that I've seen in the last year was actually a young girl out of high school, 17 years old, and she created a special entrance that has thymol laced on it, and thymol and mites don't really do too well together. So when the bees come in, if they have a mite on them, as they pass through that thymol entrance, the mite itself will end up becoming paralyzed and fall off the bee. And so this is one way they're fighting. I thought that was just the coolest invention ever, because it's so simple and so non-invasive on the colony itself. It's great. The other thing we look for is food. We want to make sure our bees have enough food to sustain themselves. And when they do run out of food, just like anyone else in farming, if you have an animal and it's out of food, you're going to feed it. And so during good times of the year, during honey flows, you will see lots of honey. You can see the wax cappings over this honey here. This isn't quite ready yet. The bees will cap the wax over after a certain amount of time to ensure that it does not ferment beforehand. And then over here, we can actually see pollen, which is the protein source that the bees feed the larvae. Sorry, I forgot to mention this. The honey is the actual carbohydrate source. So this is something that the workers would mainly feed on. But they will mix the honey with the pollen and feed that to the larvae. So those larvae get the majority of their protein from pollen from other plants.
So as a beekeeper, how frequently do you check for food? Is it daily, weekly?
So it really depends on the time of year. So during the winter time, we have to feed our bees to keep them going through the winter. And this is the commercial beekeepers. Hobbyists may not have to feed if they've got one beehive in their backyard. Arizona, it's always very nice weather out, so there's typically always plants in a neighborhood blooming. But for us who have hundreds of colonies and they're away from neighborhoods and they're in the middle of the desert or something, there's no food source. So we have to substitute sugar syrup to ensure that they get fed during the wintertime. And we'll also feed them pollen substitute. So we call them pollen patties. And we'll feed that during the winter as well. But I would say here in Arizona, starting in February, you're about the beginning, right about now, actually, in the next week or two, things are really going to start blooming quite a bit, especially the citrus. So the bees should be okay. But every time I open a hive, I always check for food. I just want to make sure they're strong enough to bring food in. And if they don't have food, I'll go steal a comb from another hive and put that in there so they do have food themselves. And that's the same for brood. If I see a queen's not laying fast enough or doesn't have enough workers, I'll take a frame of eggs or sealed brood and I'll put it in the weaker colony to help boost their population. Because the more population the bees have, the more they can exploit whatever food sources are around. And during real bad times, bees can travel up to about 3 miles to find food. But typically they stay within a mile or less. And then, so this is the commercial stuff. Here is, I had my bees out in Texas. These are pumpkins, and we were pollinating the pumpkins, so we were getting ready to load them on the semi because the pollination was done. There's the forklift to load all the bees on the semi, just waiting for the sun to go down. Here is California and the almonds. This is right before the almond bloom. So almonds are the biggest cash crop, and we'll talk about that here in a little bit. But roughly they take about 2.5 million beehives per year just to pollinate the almonds in California. And that's people bringing beehives from all over the nation. Here is one of my trucks. When I had it loaded, I think this was carrying about 150 beehives right here. And driving to California, the weather was nice and cold, but the bees didn't come out, so I could stop and take a little break and take a picture. And then down here, this was actually the first time I ever took bees to the almonds. These were all Africanized bees. I feel bad for the guy who was helping us because he's from California, never ran into Africanized bees, and he just got stung all over his ankles. As you can see, they're exposed right here. And yeah, lessons learned. Again, this is a moving the bees. You use a forklift. So here's an example. We were moving bees to go up north. And this little forklift right here actually is a converted golf course lawnmower that the guy here that I worked with, he built this from a lawnmower. But this is all you do. You know, you wait for the sun to come down, and then you use your forklift essentially to pick up the whole pallet. So there's 4 beehives on this pallet.
So about how many bees would that be?
4 beehives here, 3 stacks, 60. I'd say close to a quarter to 300,000 bees, 250,000 to 300,000. And then you can see here, we just loaded on the back of a truck, and we'll just stack them all down the truck and then strap them down essentially.
Nice.
Ooh, that's a scary looking face there. Sorry. And so here, these are a bunch of swarms that we caught. So these are Africanized bees, and they grew, they flew into old equipment that we just had sitting around. So we just caught these bees out of nowhere. And within a couple months, this is how much they packed up these boxes. Africanized bees grow much faster. They emerge roughly 2 days earlier than European honeybees. And when you move them, unlike European honeybees, they'll just stay inside the hive. Africanized bees, they will all crawl out of the hive and hang out on top of the boxes, which can be a pain. There we go. Checking the hives here. So this is that veil I was telling you about. This is how I personally prefer to work my bees. You know, no smoke, not much. These are very gentle colonies. This is, you work very hard to keep your bees like this. And here I am just getting ready for a honey flow. So I'm putting a box with empty combs on it so the bees can fill that comb up with honey. And then I can come back later and extract that honey. And then over here is a very nice strong beehive. I've taken the top boxes off. You can see a nice brood pattern here. This is what a beekeeper likes to see when they're opening up their hive. They want to make sure you have a very strong queen and that she has a very big brood pattern and there's not too many openings separating each of those larvae. Again, here's just some more pictures of, this was out by an alfalfa field. You can see when they're bringing in nectar and food, they really build up very quickly. This is a very strong beehive. You can see the frames are covered in bees. This is what we like to see. And I don't know what this one is here. It's been a while. Once again, I'm pulling out some combs here to kind of give it an idea of how you beekeep. So what you want to do is, you can see I'm pushing the frames apart so I can give them enough space, because what you don't want to do when you're pulling a frame out is have them too close together and then it's going to roll bees on top of each other, which could crush your queen or do other bad things. And this is fresh honey from the citrus groves, and they're just starting to pack that honey in.
So how long does it take for them to pack one of those trays?
If it is if it's a very strong honey flow, they could fill one of those boxes in a matter of 2 or 3 days. Wow. If it's a weak honey flow, it could take up to a week or 2.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. And then, so here's queen bees. These are queens that we order. This is how we replace Africanized queens or old queens that are failing. These are what are called splits. So these are colonies that I went and I made new ones by taking frames of brood from very strong colonies and some food combs. And then I order new queens because these should all be queenless. And I wait about a week before these queens. I order these queens a week in advance. So that way when they arrive, I can show up in the yard and I can pull out each frame, shake off all the bees, cut all the queen cells, put them back together, and then introduce a queen. It's important when you make a new hive and it's queenless, the bees are naturally going to want to make a new queen. So before I introduce any of these, I wait about a week because that gives a nice big giant queen cell that's really easy to see on the frame. You just shake the bees off, you cut those cells off, put everything back together and introduce your new queen into the hive. And you wait about 7 to 10 days and make sure she's chewed. The workers have chewed the candy out of the way so she can escape into the beehive and start laying eggs. And there you've got a new beehive. And then just like everything else in farming, you have to prepare for the next season. So here's me and my dad building some gates on the truck and painting lids for the beehives, etc. Creating more boxes, cleaning old frames so the bees can reuse them. And this is the honey extractor. So you put frames here. This cuts the wax off of the frames. The frames move down the assembly line. They go in this giant centrifuge. The honey gets spun out and then it leaks out into this sump right here. And then in the sump on the back here, I pump the honey out into barrels. This is an auger because you have all that beeswax that's filled with honey as well. The auger will separate the wax cappings and honey. And then I can also separate the honey from the wax cappings and melt the wax down and sell the wax and sell the honey.
Wow.
Overwintering, as I mentioned, we have to feed our bees. Here's where I have feeders inside the hive and I'm feeding the bees in the beehive themselves. Here's what we call open feeding. So I've filled this with sugar syrup and then I put in hay so the bees don't drown in it. And essentially they all come here and they feed on the sugar syrup.
Wow.
So you can see it gets very, very active. This is wintertime feeding because there's no other food source around. Okay, so I think that kind of gives us a little introduction to the background in bees a little bit in commercial beekeeping.
So I have a couple of questions I'd like to tackle.
Okay.
So I'm getting the impression that bees, honeybees, are very, very important to our society. Can you talk about that a little?
Oh, absolutely. So if you ever wondered how honeybees contribute to crop pollination or the amount of money involved in it, so roughly honeybees contribute about $20 billion a year in U.S. crop production, meaning without honeybees, we would roughly lose about $20 billion. Because when a bee pollinates a crop, essentially what it's going to do is increase the yield of whatever that fruit or nut that is coming from that tree. So in California, for example, honeybees, or excuse me, almonds, about 80% of the world's almonds come from California. And this is a very big cash crop. They pay us beekeepers to bring our hives from around the nation to California, and they pay us a very good premium. I believe this year the going rate for renting a beehive to pollinate the almonds is around $200 a hive. So if you've got 100 beehives and you can transport them to a California, they're going to pay you roughly $20,000 to drop those bees off and just sit there for 4 weeks during the bloom. And then as soon as the bloom is over and the flowers fall off, we come in, we pick up our beehives, and then some of us like me would drive them back home, where I would put them on citrus in the beginning, towards the end of the citrus bloom. Or some of the other commercial beekeepers who have crops outside of California may take them to like the blueberries up in Washington or Oregon. You've got other ones going to cherries. So cherries is another very big cash crop for beekeepers. You have avocados now, which are really starting to explode. More and more people love their avocados, and they need to be pollinated. And another big cash crop is actually canola oil, or that comes from the rapeseed, a very beautiful yellow flower. And then here in Arizona, it's actually quite important for several crops down here. We can get paid for pollinating things like apples down in southern Arizona. As I mentioned before, the citrus, that was always a big one. One of my favorite honeys is orange blossom honey. I grew up here in Arizona, and where we grew up, it was all orange groves. So that was kind of the honey that we always got growing up. I briefly mentioned melons. So I did pollinated pumpkins out in Texas, but we also have a lot of melon farmers here in Arizona, such as watermelon and cantaloupe, and bees are very important for pollinating those crops. The interesting thing about those, they don't really produce a lot of nectar, so even though we have bees there pollinating those crops, they're only picking up pollen, and that's not enough to sustain the beehive. So sometimes on specific crops, we still have to substitute sugar syrup in those crops in order to allow the bees to actually continue to grow, because pollen is just not enough. So sometimes we'll put them in, for example, the pumpkins, and I also would have to go and feed them sugar syrup while they're pollinating the pumpkins, because they're not collecting nectar from those flowers. They're only moving pollen around from one flower to the next.
Do honeybees pollinate crops that aren't human food crops? So like maybe a sorghum or a cotton. Cotton's big in Arizona.
Oh, yes. So we've got the other two really big crops that we don't get paid to pollinate, and bees aren't necessarily needed for these crops, but it's still important, is, as you mentioned, cotton. Honeybees pollinate cotton. Cotton has some very beautiful flowers, but the majority of the nectar source actually comes from little nectarines, which are underneath the stems of the branching parts of the cotton bush. And alfalfa, the stuff we feed horses. Cotton, A few of the farmers I've talked to, they like having bees there because they do feel it does increase the yield of cotton production, which I will err on their side. They would know more than myself. Um, and then alfalfa. So most farmers, they really don't want their alfalfa to go to bloom. But here in Arizona, the heat really forces those flowers into bloom faster than they can keep up with cutting most smaller farmers. And so alfalfa has a very beautiful purple flower, and typically right around June, end of June, they will start blooming. So when it gets over 105 degrees, the alfalfa will bloom very quickly. And this is great for us beekeepers because, like I said, most farmers can't keep up with the cutting of the flowers. So it produces a very delicious honey, and it is a really good crop to have the bees on.
So
that was too. Yeah.
Yeah, we talked about moving the bees to other states, but we move them at night. So are you limited by where you can take them by one night's drive, or can you go further than that?
So we're not. No, we're not limited. So the good thing too is as we're driving, once you get above about 45 miles per hour, which is, most highways and freeways and all that, the bees, the wind forces so much that, again, they'll just pretty much stay inside. They may crawl outside a little bit and crawl around. You're definitely going to lose some bees in the netting. But for the most part, once you hit a high speed, they'll stay inside. And that's how people from Florida are able to load up a semi, and then within 2 or 3 days, that semi's in California and they're unloading the bees there. And what those drivers do, they'll drive mostly at night, they'll drive during the day nonstop and then sleep for a little bit at night and then get up before the sun comes up and start driving again just to get that, wind speed going. But there were nights or days, I should say, where I worked about 29 hours straight from the time I woke up in the morning to get the bees prepared to leave that evening. And then coming back later on in the evening, loading them onto the truck. And that takes quite a bit of time. And then waking up and just starting to drive. And driving from here to California for 12 hours straight. The fun part is sometimes you do have to drop down to about 40, 45 miles an hour. The reason being, you want a time when you actually arrive in that yard because you want to get there as the sun is going down or as it's already dark. Because if you stop in that field and the sun is still out and you start taking those nets off, there's going to be millions of bees everywhere and they're going to be very confused. So it's better to time it so you get to your area as the sun's going down. Wow. Here in Arizona, the furthest I would travel is about 4 hours up to Holbrook to drop the bees off up there sometime around June, because that's down here in the valley. We have a dearth unless your bees are on alfalfa, which means there's no food available during that time before the monsoons come. But if you go up north, there's a little bush. It's actually a weed called the camel thorn bush, and the bees make a really amazing honey off that bush, and that blooms typically about mid-June through mid-July, which is perfect timing because then you come back mid-July and the alfalfa is in full bloom, and then a month later the cotton goes into bloom. So it's really about managing where can I put my bees so I don't have to give them the resources they'll need to get through the next couple weeks. And then at the same time, it allows us to produce all these different honeys, and each honey does taste different based on the flower source that the bees are foraging on.
Yeah, my favorite's the alfalfa.
Yes, it is. Alfalfa and orange blossom are my two. Orange blossom's number one, but alfalfa is definitely my second favorite. The mesquite, it has kind of an earthy tone to me, which I prefer. My honey is a very sweet floral note. I really like the taste of the flowers. The orange blossom, you can really taste the orange blossoms in there. If you've grown up in Arizona and been here when all those flowers are in bloom, it's just the most amazing smell, and that smell is how that honey pretty much tastes.
So for those of us who aren't beekeepers, hobbyist or otherwise, what are things that we can do to help bees survive or even any other local pollinators? What are things that we can do
Yes.
just locally?
So I've have some plants and things listed down here, but what I want to talk about first is because you mentioned sustainability. You know, here in the United States, we really produce on a monoculture through monoculture scales. You know, almonds, you're talking over 1.5 million acres that are just dedicated to almonds in California. So when those almond trees are done blooming, there's nothing else that grows on those millions of acres until the next year. I think with living in other countries has really opened my eyes to the idea that, you know, local farms, and they don't have to be a big farm, but just a local area that grows crops year round could be really used in our neighborhoods, and those crops could sustain our local pollinators, and they can sustain you know, 1 or 2 honeybee colonies sitting on that land. So, for example, when I lived in Japan, we had multiple farms that were around my little apartment complex, and they supplied our city, including our schools, with the crops that they grew. So I guess the one downside, and I don't feel it's a downside, but the reality is when you do something like that, you are going to be eating that one specific fruit or fruit or vegetable for, you know, 3-4 weeks straight until the next crop is up. So you don't get all the different things you would find at the grocery store, but you'd still get a decent amount. So I feel moving forward, we could really change some of our landscape by just dedicating maybe small parcels of land to a community garden that can feed the local community and also take care of our local pollinators and honeybees, because we are losing roughly 10% of our insect population yearly, not just honeybees, but all of them. And that's a real scary thought, to be without insects, because they do more than what we tend to think about. But as far as if you just want to put some stuff up in your yard, you know, we have a lot of desert plants here. And desert plants tend to bloom almost year round, depending on the type of plant it is. But things that grow during the wintertime are some of the best. So like Coulter's lupine, which is a blue flowered little plant that you can buy, that tends to bloom between January and May. You've got globe mallow, which has a very beautiful orange flower, and this actually blooms multiple times throughout the year. These are things that provide nectar and pollen sources. Milkweed, that's a big one, especially for all kinds of local pollinators and our monarch butterflies that migrate down to Mexico each year. So some of us see these as weed plants. They have flowers that are actually important to the microenvironment in the area. You have your clover plants that grow year-round. Those are easy to plant. Desert honeysuckle plants, those are easy to maintain. Those bloom multiple times throughout the year. Fairy duster. So typically these only bloom maybe in February or March, but what I've noticed on our plant, it'll actually bloom multiple times throughout the year, depending on the temperature that is around. And then you have your desert trees, your mesquites, your palo verdes. All of these plants too don't take a lot of water. We live here in the desert, so I've using plants that take less water and are natural to our area is better than trying to introduce plants from other states or other areas that may take more water and may not bloom at certain times. And then the other big one I would probably say is creosote bush. And that's also one that blooms multiple times throughout the year and has a nice, beautiful yellow flower on it.
So you mentioned Africanized bees. Is that the same as a killer bee? And is that a real thing?
Yes. Africanized bees kind of showed up here in Arizona somewhere in probably the mid 80s, and we lost our last known European bees around 1992. They were down in Oracle, Arizona, which is down by the biosphere, if anyone's familiar with that. And one of the people I worked with, she was studying these German bees and the invasion of the Africanized honeybee. And between 1992, when they checked them, and they came back in 93, those bees had been completely bred out, and the only thing left were these Africanized bees. Now, they are the same, as you mentioned, as the killer bees. What I'd like to hopefully educate people on is that the Africanized honeybee is still a honeybee. It's the same thing as a European honeybee. The main difference being they're just more aggressive. They will protect their food and their colony tenfold in compared to a European honeybee. So, for example, if you were to go up to a European honeybee colony, do something to kind of upset it, they may send out, I don't know, 6 to 10 bees to come out and inspect and see what's happening and to make sure nothing crazy is going on. Whereas an Africanized honeybee colony, you can walk up to the colony, and before you even get there, you're going to have bees flying in and bumping into you, trying to tell you to get away. And if you get too close to it, they will send out roughly 60% of the colony to chase you away, which can then be tens of thousands of bees. In a European colony, we're talking maybe 5% of the colony might come out to inspect or attack, versus, again, Africanized colony, which will send out about 60% of the colony to attack you.
So if you're being chased by Africanized bees, what do you do?
The best thing, or the one thing you should never do, is don't jump in a pool, please. I've heard this before, but the problem is bees are attracted to carbon dioxide. So what's going to happen when you pop your head out of that water and they're just hovering over, and you go to take a big giant breath, they're going to fly right into your mouth. So the best way to get away from bees, and the other one I want to dispel too before I go on actually, is getting a hose and trying to hose your friend off. All you're doing then is making your friend wet, and they're getting stung at the same time. So now they got two bad things happening. So the best way is to get inside somewhere, whether that's getting back in your car or going inside a building and closing the door behind you. Granted, a few bees are going to follow you inside, but as soon as you close that door, the majority of those bees are going to feel that change in pressure, and they're going to go right back to where the exit was, and they're going to try to escape. And then some of them are going to still hang out and try to sting you, but I'd rather get stung by 5 or 6 bees than several thousand that are waiting outside that door for me. So don't jump in a pool, and don't get your garden hose out and hose people off.
Good advice. Thank you. This has been really informative. Thank you, Nick. It's been wonderful to learn about our honeybees here. And I know that we plant the wild desert flower packets in the front every year.
Oh, beautiful.
And we get a bunch of bees who come through. So I think that's something anybody can do. If they even have a small spot in their yard, they can plant those, and they're really beautiful to look at. So food for the bees as well.
They are, and cacti and all that stuff, they flower too, and some of them, as you can see pictured here, will flower, and the bees will make some beautiful nectar off them if you have a hive or whatnot. Here's that camel thorn bush up in Holbrook, Joseph City area up north. It's a very small flower. There's that alfalfa I was talking about, a beautiful field of purple flowers when it goes in bloom. And then we've already talked about the products, but here's those Africanized bees. So they can live anywhere. This is a cotton tree. Oh, how much I despise these cotton trees, because they hollow from the inside out, and they make the most wonderful beehives. And when we did a removal here, there was a beehive in this branch and a whole nother one over here in this one. Wow. So we had to cut it quite a bit off. And here you can see us sucking the bees out with a vacuum, because we did live removals, and we would transport these bees to our apiary and requeen them with a nice gentle queen. And in about 2 months, you have a colony that's nice and gentle. And here's the swarms. You'll see these around Arizona. One thing I do want to point out, these are very gentle. They will never harm you. They're protecting the queen. They're resting. If you see one of these, wait 24 to 48 hours. It should go away. They're just looking for a home. If not, then I would call a beekeeper and they can come and shake this off into a box and they can take that swarm with them and give them comb. And then they can start growing into a big beehive. And again, requeened, and you've got a nice new gentle beehive after a couple months.
I think that's really important because I wasn't aware that you could requeen Africanized bees and have them be more gentle. So I think that's
Yeah.
important for us to understand about bees.
Yeah, and they are a little more difficult to requeen, but once you get it in, like I said, that new queen will start laying eggs, and then as soon as her bees start to emerge and start foraging, they'll push the old bees out as they forage until they die, essentially.
Wow.
And then here's a couple links for honeybee information and stuff like that.
Great. And we'll also put those up on the page for people to go ahead and live grab those. Thank you so much for your time today, Mr. Baker. It's been wonderful having you talk to us about honeybees.
Awesome. Thank you, Kimberly. I appreciate you actually letting me come and do this.
Thank you.
So it's been fun.